Zoom in on global affairs with insightful debates and exclusive interviews. This is World Insight.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. As the U.S. and Israel continue offensive on Iran, Tehran faces a future without Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. After announcing Khamenei's death on Sunday, Iran went into 40 days of national mourning. Grieving Iranians took their anger over the Supreme Leader's killing to the streets on Sunday, calling for retribution. With no end to hostilities in sight, many warned the Middle East could spiral into deeper instability and chaos. The conflict did bear a disturbing warfare pattern of missile and drone strikes, rapid deployment with deadly efficiency. So how far and wide could the raging conflict go? What is the scope of likely spillover with damage to regional and even global economies as feared by many? Let's loop in our panelists. Joining us in Singapore, James Dorsey, adjunct senior fellow at Singapore's Rajaratnam School of International Studies. In Doha, Sultan Barakat, professor of public policy at Hamad bin Khalifa University. In Beijing, Rong Ying, senior research fellow from China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, the latest development, the military conflict continues, not only joint military operations by Israel and the United States against Iran, but also retaliatory actions taken by Iran toward Israel, the U.S. military bases in the Middle East, and some of the key infrastructures in some of the surrounding areas. So tell us more about your thoughts, Mr. Barakat, after covering decades of conflicts in the Middle East. How do you see the nature of this conflict?
Well, it's unprecedented in the sense that this is now going unilaterally almost. You know, Israel has decided, the United States has joined in a coalition of two countries. In the past, in this region, we have had coalitions coming together. When the invasion of Iraq took place, there were about 40 countries and so on. They attempted at least to get a layer of legitimacy to the war by taking it to the Security Council. It was rejected. They came up with other excuses and so on. But this time, they used the same kind of excuse, that there is an imminent threat of a weapon of mass destruction, but without any ability, without any debate, without any engagement of the partners, including the very key partners in the Gulf. The Gulf states, who are now at the receiving end of the retaliatory act by Iran, were not part of the decision to go to war. All of them have warned against it and thought it was a bad idea, and anticipated that this would be the reaction of the Republic of Iran.
Mr. Dorsey, you have been participating in conflict resolution in conflict resolves and negotiations for decades. Tell me more about your judgment of nature of this latest conflict compared to the earlier decades of wars and conflict in the region, particularly its possible impact.
Conflicting parties go to negotiations if and when the price of not negotiating and fighting on becomes too high. That's not the case at this moment in Iran. The United States and Israel allegedly are determined to change the regime, to eradicate Iran's nuclear capabilities, or what's left of that, as well as its ballistic missile program. The Iranians, on the other hand, feel that the price has to be raised, particularly on the part of the United States, to come to a negotiation, particularly a negotiation in which they would have a degree of leverage. So, with other words, increasing the number of U.S. casualties in the conflict, increasing the pain that Gulf states and others are suffering as a result of Iranian retaliatory strikes. Yeah. So, and finally, what victory means for the Iranian regime is survival, whether that's with the current Supreme Leader and military command and security command, or their successors, doesn't matter, as long as the regime survives.
The United States, according to the U.S. president, the operation is going to continue for weeks. That is the latest quote coming from him. Meanwhile, of course, we are seeing the Supreme Leader has been killed. by the attack in Iran. What do you think these messages are telling us about the nature of this conflict to come?
The United States, Trump, and certainly Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, have been very clear what their aim is: the regime change. The problem with that is that the way they see regime change is that they will degrade the regime, kill its leaders, and the masses will go to the streets to protest. That's not the way regime change happens. Protests, you can go back to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, when I was there, when it was elements of the Air Force and the Navy that finally broke the cohesion of the regime. There's no indication at this point that the cohesion, even though there are differences within the political elite or the military or security forces, is weakening.
What is likely to be the system in Iran to come up with the one to take his place? Do you see among some of the candidates already being proposed, reported by the media, there are likely ones that's going to have the power and the capability to not only direct the military operation of retaliation by Iran toward the United States and Israel, and also be able to put the countries in place, so to speak, at a time of crisis? Mr. Barakat.
Yes, well, they do have their own constitutional procedures, which they already followed. They've constituted a council of 3 leaders, including the current president, who is going to chair this council, to continue to run the affairs of the state. I think the complexity is in their defense structures. The Iranians, and on purpose, have a very complex defense structure. Much of it will probably have gone into autopilot at the moment in terms of throwing as much of their missiles on Israel and those targets as they could, because they have learned the lesson from their war in South Lebanon, that when they tried to restrain the retaliation, the technology is much more advanced on the side of Israel and the United States, and they were able to take out a lot of those spaces. And therefore, I think this retaliation waves of retaliation will continue for some time until the political administration takes control of the situation. And I very much agree with James. I think it's very unlikely that there will be a regime change. There may be a change in characters, but it will still not be sufficient for Israel. Israel wants more than regime change. They want a degree of normalization. They would like Iran to line up with the rest of the countries that are happy and willing to accept the existence as well as the practice of the Israeli state as is, not changed with the very big ambitions they have in the region.
We have seen latest attacks by Israel against Hezbollah in the neighboring countries. So once again, the question really is how widespread this whole thing will likely to be.
Iran has been here before. If you go back to 1979, 1980, you had within a very short period of time 2 presidents, 3 prime ministers killed. You had 72 members of parliament, including very senior ones like Ayatollah Beheshti, dying in a bomb attack. You saw in June of last year the elimination of the highest command of the security and the military, them being replaced. They were killed, and yet the Islamic Republic and its defense structure is still intact and working. With regard to the widening of the conflict, we're already seeing it. We're seeing it in virtually every Gulf state. We're seeing it in in Lebanon as of today. You could now, if you get a situation in which Iran disintegrates or in which there is chaos or anarchy, keep in mind that all of Iran's borders are populated by ethnic minorities, some of them very restive. Azeris in the Turkish-Iranian, Azerbaijani triangle, Kurds in the west bordering on Turkey and Iraqi Kurdistan, the Arabs, the Baloch, the Lors, the Turkmens. And that means, particularly if you get the Azeris, trouble in the Azeri regions of Iran, that you could get an involvement by Turkey and Azerbaijan. In other words, a significant widening of this conflict.
Mr. Barakat, also about a similar question. So we are also seeing infrastructures being destroyed in the Middle East. For example, some famous hotels, some parts of the airports, and possibly ports as well. Of course, Iranian side, according to the Iranian media, has been explaining to their neighbors about what they are targeting is the U.S. military base and U.S. military infrastructure. So how much danger this whole region is really facing?
Well, obviously, there's the huge danger of drawing the Gulf states into this war. If the Gulf states fall into this and they again respond to the Iranian retaliation and they become direct partners in this war, then I think we're in for many, many decades of conflict and total draining of resources in the Gulf, where only the Gulf states and Iran will lose. And this is really the irony about all this, that the Americans seems to have thrown the Arab states under the bus for the sake of Israel, and not just for the sake of Israel, for the sake of a personal agenda by Netanyahu. And this is where I think we really need to spend some time questioning the reasoning and the justification that Trump is going to present to the US people and to the rest of the world. And I tend to maybe agree with some of the analysts that this is being approved by him as a distraction from other political agendas that are now pressing, including the Epstein files and many other things that are now cornering him in the United States and issues that Netanyahu is facing.
All right.
And therefore, I think the Arab states have got to be very careful in how they respond.
Right.
It is true that the Iranians warned them at the beginning and said, we will be going for the bases. And that's why all the Gulf states have denied the use of their bases to the United States. None of them agreed that any attack can be launched from those bases. And that's one of the reasons why the US brought its aircraft carriers to the region and built up the force from here, because originally they could have just acted from those bases. But I think the Iranians are looking for any possibility to draw American blood. And they were successful in the case of Kuwait. They've thrown missiles on a base, and there were 3 soldiers killed.
Right.
And that's maybe the main motivation for them at the moment. But yes, our main concern that if the Gulf states were to react to defend their own sovereignty, which some of them are already talking about, then the war will widen. And then it will take different nature, because
Indeed.
For them, they are neighbors to Iran and could involve, soldiers on the ground. The Iranians can easily, there are 90 million of them and a huge army. And that will be impossible then to de-escalate.
China already made clear statement. Mr. Rong, where is China stand, and how does China see the international response so far?
Very much concerned about the military operations and also the possibility. Actually, it's already sort of spreading, escalating of this crisis that already, maybe even to a wider region. So this is very much, I think, clear. And secondly, I also noticed that the 2 unacceptables Wang Yi, the foreign minister, expressed when he had a phone conversation with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. Unacceptable because first unacceptable refers to the fact that while there were the ongoing negotiations on the nuclear issues between Iran and United States, the military strikes happened. That is unacceptable. The second unacceptable, I think, which is also even more telling, is that targeting killing of a leader of a sovereign state and openly, publicly call upon a regime change is totally unacceptable. And of course, with these, the Chinese petitions also come up with 3 points of proposals by, again, calling for immediate cessation of military actions and call for come back to the negotiation tables. And last but not least, I think working together, joint efforts, China and Russia, but also I think international community as a whole. And this is very much reflects, and I can see the positions of the majority of the international community, be it in Asia, be it in Europe and others. All of them are calling for restraints, calling for the succession of military actions, and most importantly, calling for, I think, negotiate solutions.
Okay.
This is very much touch upon the bottom line of the rules and norms governing international sort of state-to-state relations. In the post, it touched upon the very theme, the principle of post-World War II. That's why one said that it is very much, I think, related to these rules and norms, and whether the international order will sort of divert it to a kind of law of jungle instead of the rule-based international order.
Now, Mr. Dorsey, as you earlier indicated, at the conflict this time, we are seeing only the United States and Israel were working together on the military strikes against Iran. Unlike 2 decades ago, for example, during the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, there is a large coalition of many joining in. What does that say? But at the same time, we're witnessing latest development of some European countries likely to express a different direction in terms of how they are seeing the latest conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran, just within 24 hours. How do you read this?
Well, first of all, and that harks back to what Sultan was saying, essentially the difference between Iraq in 2003, or Afghanistan for that matter in 2001, and today in Iraq, you were responding. You had a coalition, indeed. The United States and Israel are not looking for a coalition. In fact, Trump, for all practical matters, has changed international diplomacy. His foreign policy is one that is based on the principle of might is right, that you coerce, you bully, you intimidate, you back that up with shows of military force, and now, in fact, with implementing military force, and you force your counterparty to bow to your demands.
But what about the other players? For example, at the very beginning of this conflict by U.S. and Israel against Iran, we are hearing through media reports by BBC, British government official, without naming the name, has been suggesting the UK wants both sides to negotiate rather than go into military conflict. But now we are hearing some very different media reports. I do not have definite ones coming from their spokesperson at this hour, but there seems to be some changes. So, Mr. Dorsey, how much danger is there that some of the old habits die hard, so to speak, that countries would join the United States and Israel in a military conflict against Iran, even though at the UN Security Council, many are condemning this action?
Well, first of all, you've already had the change. You've had the British Prime Minister on camera coming out and saying, we will not participate in offensive operations, but British facilities in the region are available to the United States in the campaign against Iran. Now, Iran has contributed to this. It has struck at a British military base in Cyprus. It has struck at a French military base in the United Arab Emirates. And so therefore, and in fact, the one in Cyprus is European Union territory. So it's not all that surprising that you're seeing a shift in European attitudes.
So there is possibility of shifting our European attitudes, just as the attitudes of the Gulf states. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is the attitudes of certainly certain European states, Britain, Germany, France, have shifted. You've seen a very different position on the part of the Spaniards, for example, who have outright condemned the Israeli and U.S. action. But in terms of the E3, as it described, you've seen that shift, and you've seen it confirmed at the highest levels of government.
I think it's also important to remember that some of those countries, particularly Britain and France, have joint defense arrangements and agreements with some of the Gulf states. For example, in Qatar, there is a joint squadron run by the Royal Air Force and the Qatari Air Force, And that if they feel they have to do something to defend the airspace of the countries that they've been working with for decades. And in some cases, there's been a huge investment at stake. So they are in a difficult position, particularly, I think, Britain and France. Other Europeans are a little bit distant from these strategic interests, and they can think a little bit more freely. And of course, we should also remember that all European countries need the United States in Ukraine, and they will do whatever, at the end, whatever the United States asks of them, because they would like the United States to continue to stand by them in the war against Russia.
I would also like to invite every one of you to briefly tell us, how do you read this conflict with the bigger backdrop in the world today?
Well, I think the world will start to see the effect as the markets open up this morning in first in Southeast Asia, and then as it goes around Europe and the United States, and particularly in terms of the energy supply, both in terms of the shutting off of the Iranian contribution to the market, but also access through the Hormuz Strait, which has now already started to suffer. Companies are less willing to take their ships into that part of the world, and so on. So I think the world will feel that effect. The U.S. does not mind, because their strategic supply or reserve is at the highest, and they have been drilling for oil. They are exporting oil. For them, they will obviously be affected by the rise in international price, but not in a strategic way like other countries. And I think more countries ought to go and discuss things, knowing that if we keep only talking about norms and rules of the United Nations, then we are heading to nowhere, because we're dealing with an actor, particularly Israel under Netanyahu, who does not recognize the United Nations. He does not recognize the rules, the norms, or anything it stands for. In fact, he looks at them as biased or arrangements against Israel. So there has to be something stronger than just condemnation, I think, at this stage. And someone has got to be able to say enough is enough. And if we are genuine about negotiations, then those negotiations has got to be protected and nurtured in a way that could lead to some form of stability in the region.
Right. Mr. Dorsey, the Strait of Hormuz is extremely crucial at this moment, 85%. We're seeing the energy, for example, for China, 85% of those being transported over there are going to China, India, South Korea, Japan. And also, it is such an important area for international business, not to mention just the energy. So, Mr. Dorsey, how much are we looking at the economic cards being played by different sides, particularly when you have the United States, its economy at this moment is experiencing quite some uncertainty as a result of earlier tariffs against other economies in the world?
There are the economic aspects, and fundamentally the economic aspects of the economic impact of this conflict are going to be negative. And they're going to be difficult for countries across the globe. I was talking about the Trump administration. Venezuela did not stand up to the Americans. Panama did not stand up to the Americans. The Europeans compromised when it came to Greenland. This is the first time that a country has put its foot down and simply said, no, we're going to negotiate. We're not going to surrender. And that, I think, an important milestone.
At this moment, there has already been a lot of comments about the styles of military conflicts taking place these days. We saw that in Venezuela by the United States. And once again, that style seemed to continue this time by US and Israel against Iran. So what do you make of these latest styles used by the US? And how likely they are going to impact both the way of conflicts in the future and this time, and also how negotiations will ever likely to be done?
Well, I think the style of decapitating a state, maybe it has been there before, but it used to be done covertly, in a kind of under the table assassinations. Now we see something different, where they go publicly and openly using Air Force to do this. Israel did it for Yemen. The Prime Minister of Yemen and his cabinet were taken out. They've done it in Syria. They've done it in lots of other places in Lebanon and so on. This in itself is relatively new, I think. And they are fully aware of its illegality, but they don't care. And as James was saying, that if they have the force, then they think that's the legal aspect of it, and they have the right to do it. It's a very high risk agenda, but for them it seems to be drawing results. The ultimate result, I think, from our perspective, is what happens next, the day after they do this. Will there be a sustainable outcome for those attacks or not? And the likelihood is really not. I think they will draw the region into chaos. And as we were saying earlier, there's 90 million people in Iran, and they're fully capable of regenerating new leaders. And if anything, their grievances will be even greater.
And that's all the time we have for today. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us.